Hi class, we're going to pick up here with lesson 4A, which is entitled Budgeting Operations. The theme of this lesson is personal finance, and we're going to talk about some budgeting with students' budget for all the things that they need, comparing to different scenarios of them living at home with parents or off campus in an apartment. So we're going to start with the first question asks us, what does room and board mean? And so room and board is used a lot, and people used to know what it meant because it was real common. But anymore we kind of throw it around and we kind of mean just the room part when we say it. But room and board technically means room and food. So if someone says that they're going to give you room and board, they're technically telling you that they're going to give you someplace to sleep and that they're going to feed you. So this line here in the table is including where, having a place to stay and your food. So those are combined in room and board there. If you live at home with your parents, it wants to know, why is there a difference between the room and board for living at home with parents versus living off campus? So at home, it estimates that you're going to spend $2,424, and if you live in an off-campus apartment, it's $6,806. Well, what's the difference between those? Well, if you're living at home with your parents, I would venture to guess that you're not paying the entire mortgage or rent for most people, and so your room cost is going to be significantly lower because you're not paying a full mortgage or rent. Whereas over here, if you're living off campus in an apartment, you're going to have to pay for your own apartment. You may have a roommate or not, but it's still going to be more expensive than if you're staying in somebody else's home. And then the board part, if you're at home with your parents, you're likely eating meals a lot of times with the families, or eating food that's in the house for the family, and so you're not going to probably spend as much on food. Whereas over here, you're going to have to furnish your own food and do your own cooking and all that kind of thing. So those are some of the things that could make a difference between the room and board between the parents and living off campus. So the next question it's going to ask is approximately what percentage of the total cost of attendance does room and board cost if you're living at home? So here's the cost for room and board if you're living at home, and here's the total. So we want to know what percentage of the total that is. So if we have 2,424, and we want to know how much that is out of 12,119, that's a division problem. It's this much out of this much. It's a fraction of the total cost. So it says try to work without a calculator, but we're not gonna mess with that. We're just gonna go ahead and calculate it out. So if we take 2,424 and we divide that by 12,119, we get this number. Let me talk about the division just a little bit. This bar right here literally means divide. When you write out this problem as a division problem, so we've got 2,424 divided by 12,119. This division symbol is actually derived from a fraction bar. This is a fraction bar, and these dots on the top and the bottom are supposed to represent the numerator and the denominator that you've written in front and after. So this would be the 2,424, and this would be the 12,119. You don't really need to that's just kind of an interesting fact. But the most important thing here is that you remember that a division bar is the same as a division sign. It's the same calculation. It's the same symbol. So on the calculator, we got 0.200016. I'm going to round this to the third decimal spot. So I'm going to round it to 0.200, and I'm going to leave that 0 alone because after it is a 0. So rounding says we're going to round this up if it's 5 or larger, so I'm not going to round this up to 1. 0.2000 is closer to 0.200 than it is to 0.201. Okay, so this is approximately equal to, and I'm going to fix this because it's bothering me. Probably doesn't make that much difference, but this shouldn't be an approximately. This should just be an equals. So that equals that, and then this is approximately 200, which is 20.0%. Okay, so now we're going to pick up with number 6. I skipped 3, 4, and 5 because they were asking you to discuss things with your group and come up with different ways of doing things. And so we're going to go ahead and move on to number 6. Number 6 asks, approximately what percentage of the total cost of attendance do books and supplies cost for each of the two scenarios? So we have books and supplies, which would be this number, out of the total. So for the first group of students that live at home with their parents, their average cost of books and supplies is $1,222, and that's out of their total $12,119. Now I could tell this is going to be pretty close to 10% because this is pretty close to 12,000 and this is pretty close to 1,200. 1,200 is 10% of 12,000, and so this is going to be close to that. So I'm going to again divide 1,222 divided by 12,119, and that comes out to be approximately a little bit more than 10%. So we have 0.100833. I'm going to round to this spot, but this time I'm not going to leave that a 0 because it has an 8 after it. So 0.10008 is closer to 0.1001 than it is to 0.100. So this spot is where I'm rounding to. I look to the right, that's an 8, so I rounded up. So 0.101, which is 10.1%. Now for the other group, I still have 1,222, but it's out of their larger budget of 15,710. Well, we know that that's not going to be the same number as above, but what's it going to do to the number? Do you think that as percentage-wise, are we going to get a smaller number or a bigger number? One thing we could do to kind of strategize that is think about a smaller fraction, or some smaller fractions. Let's say you had 3/4, and you wanted to compare that to 3/10. Well, 3/4 is 0.75, and 3/10 is 0.3. So 0.75 is much bigger than 0.3. Why is that? Well, 3, when you only have a total of 4, is a much larger portion of that. Think about taking a pizza and cutting it into 4 pieces. If you ate 3 of those pieces out of only 4, that's a lot more of the pizza than if you cut the pizza into 10 pieces, which would be a weird way to cut a pizza. But let's say you had 10 pieces in your pizza and you ate 3 of them. Well, that would leave still 7 of those 10 pieces behind. So making this number bigger makes this top number not worth as much. So 3/10 is much smaller than 3/4. So here, same thing. We have a much bigger budget. So the cost of books and supplies is going to be a smaller part of the budget. So again, we're going to do 1,222, whoops, divided by 15,710. Hold on, that looks horrible. Let me rewrite that. Okay, so that would be 1,222 divided by 15,710. And I get 0.07778 and etc. I'm going to again round out 3 spots, so that's 1, 2, 3. I want to round to this 7, and after that 7 is a 7. So I'm going to round this up to 8. I'm going to round it to 0.078. If I rounded it to 0.077, that doesn't make sense because 0.0777 is closer to 0.078 than it is to 0.077. So this is going to round to, long story short, 0.078, which is 7.8%. So the next question says, does the difference in percentages mean that the books and supplies cost more based on where a student chooses to live? So do you spend more on your books and supplies when you live at home than when you live with, when you live at home than if you live off campus? And the answer is no, clearly not. We're spending the same amount of money, $1,222. So why are these different? Well, it's different because we're talking about your books and supplies out of your total cost, and the students that live off campus have a higher total cost. So it's only 7.8% of their budget because they have more things that they spend money on than this group of students who has less to spend their money on. So now on the next page, we have a different way to represent this data. And it actually says below is an alternative way of representing some of the data. Why does it say some of the data? Is this not the same information we had on the last page? It's your breakdown of what you spend things on at home with parents. Well, there's actually quite a bit that is left out in this pie chart that we had in the table. First of all, it only is talking about at home with parents. It doesn't talk about those that live off campus at all. So we need a second pie graph if we wanted to do that. And the other thing that it does, and this is, you can, on a pie graph, you can write in actual numbers, but this pie graph has, or pie chart has percentages. So we no longer have the actual numbers, which means we couldn't get the actual total off of this. If we didn't have that table, we wouldn't know what the total was that they spent for all of those things combined. Because if we add these percentages up, they're going to add up to 100%. But what is 100% is what we would be left asking if we didn't have that table. So it says, what fraction could be used to approximate the portion of the budget spent on room and board? So let's look at the room and board, and it says it's 20%. So 20%, they want to know what could that be as a fraction. So 20% literally means 20 out of 100. They are the exact same thing. 20% and 20/100ths mean the exact same thing. So if I wanted to write that as a fraction, well, I mean, that's one way to write it as a fraction. So we can cancel a 0 off of each of those. We could think of it as 2/10, but we could then further reduce that to 1/5. So 20% is room and board, or 1/5 of their costs are spent on room and board. For part 9, it says if a student has $1,160 to spend each month, how much is allocated to room and board? So now we're going monthly rather than by the semester. So if they have, we want to know what 20% of 1,160 is, or you could think of it as 1/5, because we just said that's equivalent of 1,160. I think the 20% is easier. This is how I would do it. There's different ways to do this. You could take 1/5 times 1,160, but I like to do the decimal because we've got the calculator handy. So I like to just change the 20% to 0.2 and multiply it by 1,160. In math, of almost always means multiply. So 20% of 1,160 means you're going to multiply to get what that is. So we're going to figure out what portion this is. And so 0.2 times 1160 gets us a total of $232. So if they were going monthly and they had 1,160 to budget, they would have $232 to spend on room and board. Okay, then for 10, it says to discuss your strategy with your neighbor, making note of different techniques. I kind of alluded to that. You could take it times 1/5. You could divide it by 5 if you wanted. There's different ways to do this, but I think this is, to me, this is the easiest way. So for number 11, It says, why is it important for the college to show students the actual values, like what were in the table, compared to just these percentages? Well, the biggest thing is, if you just showed them these percentages, that doesn't tell them how much they're expecting that you're going to spend total. If they say, if you went to the school and said, I want to pay my tuition, and they said, oh, that's 29%, please, that doesn't make any sense. 29% of what? So when they only give you the percentages, it leaves that total as a big question. We don't know what it is. Potential students could misrepresent or misinterpret the percentages if they didn't know what the total was. They might think it's 10% of whatever I make. Well, it's not whatever you make. It's the average student, which is going to vary. And so they really need to give you that information of what is the total, because we'll just kind of put a quick statement here. Without the total, we don't know the values of the percentages. The value of the percentages. So, if you say here 20% of what would be the type of question that people would want to have answered if that's all we had. So we're going to move on to 4B. Okay, so now we're going to look at something that's similar. We're still on this theme of personal finance, but we're going to look at it in a setup in a spreadsheet, an Excel spreadsheet. We're not going to actually do any Excel spreadsheets. They just kind of want to introduce you to them a little bit. And so first let's look at what's in this spreadsheet. What does the term expenditure mean? Well, expenditure is what you spend out. It's what you pay out in a given time period. So when they say total expenditures, it means total things that you paid out. What is an average family? This is supposed to represent the income for an average family. Well, an average family is going to be probably whatever the whoever's collecting the data is going to define that. They may say out of the 100 people that I get information from, I'm going to say the average family is take everything that I have and divide it by 100. Another person might say that the average family is the family that's, between the 50th and the 51st family. That's kind of up to the person who comes up with the data. And how big is the average family? We have no idea. It doesn't say anything over here. The average family could be listed as being, 3.2 people, which of course you can't have 0.2 of a person, but that's an average, so it doesn't necessarily come out as a possible answer for what you're doing. So anyway, that's for 1 and 2. I think we're good with that. And for part 3, or number 3, it says, what fraction could be used to approximate the portion of the family's income spent on food? Well, we have something that we have to figure out before we do this. We know that food is 6,458. We can see that in the table. But we have a slight problem. There's something that we haven't figured out yet that we need to figure out, and that's this total expenditures. So we're going to have to figure that out before we can calculate that. Okay, so whatever total expenditures are, that's going to go on the bottom. And it might be tempting to use this income before taxes as your total expenditures, but that's not necessarily the case. In fact, you would hope that for your total expenditures, it would be somewhat less than your income. So we can't use this income before taxes as our total expenditures. They are likely not going to be the same number. Okay, so through the miracle of technology and recording, I've added these numbers up, and I've got that my total expenditures are $49,705. Now, you have to be careful when you do this. When it says to get a total on an Excel spreadsheet, it doesn't necessarily mean it wants everything that's above that. So when I started to add, I'm not adding in the income before taxes. I'm going to start with the first expenditure, which is housing. So I can't add the $53,685 in there. That doesn't make sense. I'm trying to get things that are paid out, not paid in. So if I divide that, I get 0.1299. I'm going to again put that as a, well, it says as a fraction. So I guess I could leave it like this. I'm going to go ahead and write it as a percentage. 0.1299, because I want to round to this third spot, this 9 here, I'm going to look to the right and I see there's another 9. Well, that tells us to round it up. So the question is, do I put 0.129 or 0.130? Well, this is much closer to 0.130 than it is to 0.129. So I'm going to round this 9 up, which then, since I can't round, there's no digit higher than 9, that means I have to round the 2 up. So this is going to be approximately 0.130. And I'm actually going to leave that 0 there, even though in calculations it wouldn't matter. But it tells somebody who's looking at this that I actually did round it to the third spot, and then that third spot came out to be a 0. So it says for number 4 that a spreadsheet is a computer program used to organize and analyze data. In this example, the description housing is in what they call cell A3. So A3 is what they're talking about here. So the description is there. It says what cell contains the amount spent on entertainment. Now notice they underline this word amount, and we're not looking for the description of entertainment here at A8. We're actually looking for the total for entertainment, which is this number, and that's in B8. So it's kind of like Battleship, where you have to go how far over are you and how far down are you. So the amount on entertainment would be in cell B8. And it says formulas can be used to perform calculations in spreadsheets using the cell name as a variable. So for example, if they said in the formula equals, I'll write this out, B4 plus B5, first of all, the equals tells the Excel spreadsheet that you're trying to write an equation. So you have to have that in everything, in every equation that you write or formula that you write. You have to have that. And then this is simply what you want it to equal. So B4 plus B5 would be food, the total of food and alcohol, tobacco. So 6,458 plus 807. But we don't want to, if we wanted that total somewhere, I wouldn't want to write these numbers, because if they changed in the spreadsheet, then you'd have to update that too. The nice thing about the formula is if you change the numbers for some reason, it'll still keep the calculation right, because it'll just change whatever you put in as your new B4 and your new B5, it'll change. Then it says, notice it begins with an equal sign. Again, that's a requirement. It has to have that. What would the formula look like that would calculate a family's total expenditures? And what cell should it go in? Well, the total expenditures should go in this cell, the one that we were talking about earlier. So it should go in B14. So I should write the formula. If I wrote the formula for total expenditures in this cell, then it would calculate the total expenditures. So how do I get that? Well, there's a couple different ways to do it. The real straightforward way is just to write down B3, because remember, I don't want to start with income, I want to start with this housing. So it'd be B3 plus B4 plus B5, and you'd keep writing that. You have to write it all out. You can't do ellipses or anything. all the way to B13. Now that's a fairly long formula to write out. It's not complicated, but it's long. And if you wrote something like this on an exam, you would get it right because this is a formula for calculating that. But there is a shortcut way too. You can also write equals sum, and you can put the first spot that you want to start at all the way down to the last spot that you want to go to. So sum B3 colon B13 adds everything up from B3 to B13. If there's anything in there that you don't want, you either can't do it this way or you would have to subtract it at the end. So say I wanted the sum of all their expenditures except for what they spent on transportation. Then I could do this and then subtract out B7 if I wanted to. But we're really not going to get complicated like that. But remember, if you do it this way, that this will take every cell from B3 to B13. Either one of these would be correct answers, whatever you're more comfortable with. Don't forget the equal sign, and don't forget the word sum if you do it with the shorter method. So now the next question asks us, what formula would calculate the difference between a family's income and its expenditures? So we're looking for a difference, which means a subtraction problem. And we have the number up here that's already given for the income, and then we have the number here for total expenditures. Now there's a couple different ways we could do this. The harder way would be to take the income before taxes, and we have to start with that. We can't start with the other number. This has to be the first number. And then we're going to subtract what's in this cell. Well, if we'd written a formula for that cell already, we could just use that formula. So I could say minus, and I'm going to write this differently because I really wouldn't use the number, I'd use the cell. So let's say B2, so this equals B2 minus the sum from B3 to B13. I could do it that way. Or I could write B2 and I could literally just subtract everything out. I could say minus B3, minus B4, minus B5, and I'd have to type it all out, but I'd keep going until I got to minus B13. Again, if you were writing the formula, you couldn't use ellipses, but we'll do it for sake of time. But the easiest thing to do, you've already got this number calculated. So really all we need to do is say take B2 and subtract whatever B14 is. And that's how much will be left. And then it asks for a last question, what do you think happens to all this extra money? Or to any extra money from number 7? And that's up to the family. I mean, maybe they'll take a vacation. Maybe they'll save it. Maybe they'll donate it to charity. But that's basically money that's left over after, beyond the budget. So it's money that the family can use in whatever means that they decide. So I'm going to cut this video here because we're getting kind of long, and I'll pick up part 2 with lesson 4C.